Welcome back. All right, so this is one of those videos that I started off, I was going to do one thing, and then it turned into something else. And I was like, I want to look at rebuilds. But the interesting thing with rebuilds is it feels like there's a lot of teams that are in rebuilds. And so, got my marker out here. Now, if we're looking at future draft capital, Buffalo's still got it, but the fact that the Ottawa Senators traded picks at the deadline tells you that, Pierre Dorian's not messing around. He intends that Ottawa's out of this rebuild completely next season, right? Bringing in Chychrun, the moves that are made at the deadline, not trading out veterans on expiring contracts tells you that Ottawa feels like they're in contention for a playoff spot next year, and they wanted to send that signal to the players. And even though it hasn't had the response from the team that you would have wanted, I think due to injury and just they're not quite ready yet, Ottawa, it feels like, will graduate from this next year. That they'll be above the line or at the line, maybe around where Florida is right now, right? They're not far off of it, and if you had healthy goaltenders, who knows where they're going to be. No offense to Sogard, Mandalese, and Ferguson, but if you had healthy veteran goaltenders, you might have a team above the line. Now, for Buffalo, of course, you've got a lot of exciting young players. You've got a very solid overall roster. They're not out of it, but clearly the odds of them making the playoffs are slim at this point. And then you've got Detroit, who for 2 straight seasons now have looked like maybe they're on the verge of becoming a playoff team, and then they fade. But there's still a lot of good young pieces and a lot of building blocks there. So of the 3, it feels like Detroit's the one that might be on the best, easiest path to contention, right? Because Steve Yzerman's building this team in a similar fashion as the Tampa Bay Lightning were built up. A lot of good draft picks already. We've seen some steals from him. Even if they don't win the draft lottery, doesn't matter. He still ends up finding one of the best players in the draft, no matter where he's drafting. And that's important, right? It's something that helped Colorado get off the rebuild, retool side of things too. Getting a Cale Makar 4th overall and not complaining that they didn't win the draft lottery either. Though their fans were upset at the time, I don't think they get upset now when they look at who got drafted in the years they didn't win the draft lottery. Now, when we look at teams that are still in the rebuild, this is where things get interesting. Because you got Arizona, and Arizona's, and I've said this before and I'm saying it again, 2026. From now until 2026, this is a team that's going to be building up its young players. It's going to be trying to get guys to sign long-term contracts like we've got Keller under. If they're in that sweet spot of, say, 22 to 25, they're going to want these guys to commit to the team and stick around. But the plan is to get good when you're getting into your new building, and ideally that's 2026, right? And so then you can start building up the Arizona Coyotes to the point where they're going to be, a solid contending team. Now, I have San Jose on the board, although when I look at it, I don't know that they've officially acknowledged they're in a rebuild. It feels like at the deadline, they sold off Timo Meier. They could very well be in a rebuild, but it hasn't officially been stated. And so there's no real end date to when this is going to get better, right? But this is a team that's got some decent young prospects, but they need those blue chippers. And so they're going to have a very good draft pick this year, wherever that ends up, whether it's top 5, whether it's 6 or 7. For San Jose, they're going to get a good pick. It's a deep draft. But I haven't seen them fully committing to that rebuild either as part of what's going on. Maybe we'll get some more clarity from them this summer once the season's done even on what the plan is. Anaheim's been trucking along. It's been clear that they're in the midst of their rebuild. I think the expectation to get better will depend on their draft standing. So, in the event you draft first, you get yourself Connor Bedard. You would expect to sign him to a contract, have him in the lineup next year, and probably see a much better Ducks team. So I don't know that we have an end date for them either. For Chicago, it feels like it's just getting started. The exits of Kane and Taves likely leading to a lot of upheaval with this roster. What's left of the roster, and it's going to take some time to build this back up. It's going to take years for Chicago to build this back up and make them a playoff team again. Philadelphia, they're just announcing that they're in this rebuild situation. And so for the new general manager, it's a clean slate. You can kind of form this team however you'd like, but it does feel like Philadelphia, we're looking at years of this team trying to build things up. Montreal, I've said in videos a lot lately, I don't think Montreal is going to be in this rebuild that long. I think with Slafkovsky, and he has to be healthy next season and take that next step. And I think with a solid young blue line, and if they're able to make the right moves this summer, I think they're in good shape. They've made it clear that Montembeau's their goalie next year. It's likely that Caden Primo is the backup next year. So Jake Allen, maybe he ends up being out of town next year. We shall see. But yeah, it feels like with Montreal, I think by, I'll say 2025, we might be looking at a playoff team. So that's only a couple seasons from now. And then there's the question marks and the ones where we as fans might say, hey, these teams need a retool or a rebuild. And this is where you guys can weigh in the comment section below, as always, because there's a lot of debate. So we'll go in order on the board here. I'll start with Pittsburgh. Of course, if Pittsburgh misses the playoffs, do you do some sort of a retool? Do you change things? Do you look for the future guys? Because the talk has always been, you have Crosby, Malkin, and you have Letang, you can't rebuild. So I mentioned in the news video today, look for a lot of rumors about JT Miller headed to Pittsburgh. Look for those to head up, to really gain a lot of steam. If they miss the playoffs, does it help or hurt those rumors? And I don't have the answer because, again, a lot of surprises abound when it comes to Pittsburgh and decisions that they make. This trade deadline, they seem to double down on the idea that they felt that they could go for it again. And so far, it's been a mixed bag. Florida. So with Florida, a lot of talk about Bobrovsky's contract last year. I expect that to ramp up again this year. I don't think Bobrovsky's played up to that contract. I don't know that there's very many goaltenders that could. I just want to be clear on that. And I do think that with Florida, some kind of changes need to happen. Now, of course, last year, you can ask the question, did they overcorrect in the offseason? I think they did. I think that there was a panic that we saw where both Calgary and Florida traded guys. They didn't really have to. They didn't have to make that deal. And I think it's kind of hurt both teams. And now they're both on this maybe needing retools part of the board. And so for Florida, they've definitely underachieved. That may very well mean Paul Maurice is a one-and-done coach in terms of his time behind the bench. Or maybe they say, we like Paul Maurice. It's not Maurice. It's how this team's put together. We're going to make changes, right? So for Florida, this is going to be an interesting little week and a half we have left now to see whether or not it's Florida or Pittsburgh who ends up getting into the playoffs, which may take the pressure off and may mean that, whichever one of those two teams makes it, that there's no worries. Now, I don't have the Islanders on the board not because I don't think the Islanders could miss the playoffs, but I don't think we'll see a call for any kind of a rebuild or retool if the Islanders barely miss the playoffs. I don't get the feeling there's going to be major changes unless they decide to change the general manager. I don't think Lou Lamoriello makes major changes in the offseason, so I don't have them on the board as a retool or rebuild. Washington, I talked about Washington, and I think that with the trades that they made at the deadline, it kind of showed that, yep, they're going to go in some kind of a retool setup. Clearly Ovechkin, probably not happy with that decision. Probably not happy that the team has fallen off as far as they have. He's only got a certain amount of years left, and I think he wants to win another cup. I don't think just having the one in 2018 is enough for him. So I don't think that Washington goes into any kind of long-term setup. That's why I've got them under the retool category, because that's what I think they do. I think they'll try to turn things around over a couple of years. So if not back in the playoffs in 2024, definitely aiming to get back in 2025. Vancouver's on the board. So with Vancouver, with Rick Tocchet behind the bench and with how they've played with Tocchet, now I've mentioned too in about the last week, some of the bad habits have got back into the Canucks game. That's fine. It's the end of season. It's understandable. Anson Carter was talking about it on TNT and said, this time of year when you got a team that's out of the playoffs, it can be hard not to be thinking about the offseason and, hanging out with your family and seeing people again. Hey, just for me covering hockey every night, I'm looking forward to having more time with my family and being able to do more stuff once we get into the playoffs. And there's less time, being dedicated to the hockey side of it. Even with all the overtimes, I've seen people saying, oh, there's going to be double, triple overtime. Yes, and that's one game, and it's way, way easier and better. And I'm able to more enjoy what I'm watching as well. But for hockey players, yeah, it would be tough to focus when you're 10 days out from the end of the season. The game doesn't really mean anything. Maybe it means something to the guys on the other bench. Maybe they're desperately trying to get into the playoffs or trying to get home ice. But for you, you're on some level, I do wonder too if sometimes there's players who are trying just not to get hurt, right? So maybe you take a hit in October or November that at this point you're like, I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to separate my shoulder and end up going through the off season and rehab and potential surgery. So maybe it makes them a little bit more nervous is the wrong word, but a little more cautious in their play. So for Vancouver, there is the glass half full, glass half empty perspective of this is still a team that's below the playoff line. They're not quite good enough, but it's also a team that has performed well under Tocchet, and is that the real team, or is the real team sort of in between? And I think it's really in between. I think that in reality, they're probably not as good as they've been under Tocchet, but they're probably not as bad as they looked at points under Boudreau either. It's probably a reality of in between. I've got Columbus on the board, though, with the contract they gave to Johnny Gaudreau, with all the injuries they've had, I would expect a bounce-back season from Columbus next year. I think there'll be a bounce-back. I think that they're going to get a really high draft pick, and that's going to help them out as well. Now, whether that's a pick that comes over and plays right away or not remains to be seen. But for the Columbus Blue Jackets, I don't think they're in a rebuild, and so I've put them under the retool because this is their second season out of the playoffs, but there really is no reason for them to be overly concerned at this point. There are some good young players in Columbus. Hopefully Cole Sillinger gets his game back as one example as well of kind of a wild card in this, that if Sillinger gets his game back to where it was last year, they could be in good shape. Calgary. Calgary's a team that's got really divisive opinions all over, and it's interesting because their seasons tend to kind of fluctuate wildly, and where Calgary actually is, probably not as good as they were last year, probably not as bad as they've been this year either. So a lot of bad luck for them when it comes to overtime and shootouts and just not having the record there. And if they had a decent record there, they'd be above the playoff line. So for Calgary, if they do a retool, considering they just signed Kadri, they've got Huberdeau and Uyghur's extensions, what would that look like? What kind of changes do you make? And that's part of the reason why it's easier to make a change in coach than it is to make a change on the ice. The Flames have some pretty big contracts, and the pressure is going to be on them to turn this around quicker than otherwise might be expected. And then there's the if they lose in round one, right? So for the Winnipeg Jets have had a very up and down season, and this is after they basically stood pat during the summer. And that was despite Pierre-Luc Dubois apparently wanting to go, and now there's all this other talk about, and I've started to hear it again of, Dubois wants to go to Montreal. Okay, first off, the trade deadline's passed, so Dubois right now, my guess is his only concern is whether or not Winnipeg makes the playoffs. I would be very surprised if there's any talk at all about moving Dubois while the team is in a playoff spot and trying to stay in there. And Dubois is going to be a major part if they do. But for Winnipeg, if they lose in the first round, or especially if they fall short, if they end up falling out to, say, Calgary or Nashville, I do think we're going to see probably some major changes in Winnipeg. I don't know if rebuild's the right term, but I think we'll see some major changes in Winnipeg. And then you've got Toronto. How many years would Toronto lose in the first round before we see some kind of major change? Maybe Kyle Dubas changes his mind on that core four staying together no matter what. The one thing that occurs to me, though, with this is about half the league. So you got about half the league where we're asking who's in a rebuild, who's coming out of a rebuild, who needs a rebuild, who needs a retool. And maybe it's overdone at this point, because if all these teams end up in sort of very similar situations, you could end up with the haves and have-nots having this much wider gap in the National Hockey League in coming years, unless these three teams can come out and unless other teams on this side can turn it around quickly. Because the funny thing is, there are other teams like the Islanders, like the Preds, who are not on the board that people will be like, well, why aren't the Islanders and the Predators on there? And so maybe part of this as well is the Connor Bedard effect, or just that this draft year is considered to be really good. And so maybe there are some teams that are looking at this draft as potentially being, franchise altering and turning things around. Because, as I always say, when you've got those players who are producing points on entry-level contracts, that's gold. You are getting production for virtually no cost on your roster. But it is odd because these teams can't all be successful. They can't all be successful. I think in terms of the best one on the board, I still think is Detroit. I think Buffalo's been very good. I think the Eichel trade was a very smart one. I think the Ryan O'Reilly trade eventually worked out in that Tage Thompson's become a superstar in the NHL. But some of these rebuilds aren't going to work. And some teams like Arizona, how long have they been in a rebuild? How long has Buffalo been in a rebuild position? How long has Anaheim been in this spot? How many years can San Jose miss the playoffs before they say, you know what, we do have to kind of tear things down? And does Erik Karlsson move this summer? It will be easier for them to move Karlsson this summer than it would have been at the deadline. It would be much easier because there's a lot of contracts coming off the books. However, the flat cap makes that a little more difficult. The really big movement, probably in 2024, when that salary cap should jump quite a bit. And then maybe we see less teams being in a rebuild because then you can spend more money and maybe that's part of it as well. Maybe we'll see teams just, kind of dogging it next year, not worrying about anything and knowing that they have the money. So in 2024, we have a real race as to who's going to, and bidding wars as to who's going to get the big name free agents. But the one question I have is, are there too many teams right now in a rebuild, in a retool, or who we talk about being in rebuilds and retools? And does it make an excuse for losing? Does it make an excuse for teams that are poorly run? Because there are definitely teams that end up coming out of a rebuild looking good, but they end up going into a rebuild because they've been run poorly. They made bad contract decisions. They made bad trade decisions. Maybe they signed some guys and let other guys go, and the ones they let go they shouldn't have. A good example would be San Jose with Joe Pavelski. They let Pavelski go. That was a mistake. And Dallas is very grateful for that mistake. It is one that I think still bothers San Jose and has kept them well outside of a playoff spot. But I'd be interested to know your thoughts because, again, I was going to do a video just about, who's in a rebuild, and I realized the board was full. And I was like, this is kind of crazy to talk about success and not success when you've got what feels like almost half the league is in some form of a retool or a rebuild. And so for teams that are above the playoff line, does that make it easier for them to stay there? And could we end up seeing a season next year where that return of you have your top 8 that are in the playoffs and bottom 8 that are out, and we get that big separation? Does that come back? Do we see that in both conferences next year? Or is this just kind of a one-off, and then next year we see fewer teams that are in a rebuild position? Because I don't think the 2024 draft is going to be as star-studded as the 2023. But let me know your thoughts, because I do find it fascinating. This is always the answer is, well, just do a rebuild. Like, it's simple. When you've got that many teams that are all trying to do the exact same thing, some teams are going to fail. But let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.